The New Testament records 7 separate occasions on which a dead person was returned to life. 3 were performed by Jesus during his ministry, 1 occurred at the moment of his death, and 2 were performed by his apostles in the decades that followed. In every case, the text describes the return in detail. In not one single case does the text describe what happened afterward. The Gospel of John contains the one line that acknowledges the problem. In chapter 12, verse 10, the chief priests are described as making plans to kill Lazarus of Bethany. A man who had been dead and was now standing in a village 4 days later was evidence that could not be argued with, and so the decision was taken to return him to the condition he had been found in. The plot is recorded. Its outcome is not. This is the history of what happened to 7 people after their first death, assembled from the traditions, relic inventories, and forged tombs that grew up over 19 centuries to fill a silence the scriptures left open. The son of the widow of Nain. The first raising in chronological order appears in only one of the 4 Gospels. Luke chapter 7 places the event at the gate of Nain, a small village in Lower Galilee identified today with the Arab village of Nain, roughly 6 miles southeast of Nazareth. Matthew, Mark, and John do not mention it. The account is procedural. A funeral procession was leaving the village carrying the body of a young man on an open bier. His mother was a widow, which under first-century Galilean inheritance custom meant that the death of an only son removed her last legal support. The procession was stopped, the bier was touched, and the young man was instructed to rise. Luke records that he sat up and began to speak, and that he was returned to his mother. Neither the man nor his mother is named. No age is given, no occupation, no subsequent appearance anywhere in the New Testament or in the letters of Paul. He does not reappear in the book of Acts. He is not listed among the disciples, the 70 or the 500 witnesses named in the 15th chapter of 1 Corinthians. The village has been a pilgrimage site since at least the 4th century. Eusebius mentions Nain in his Gazetteer of Biblical Places written around 325 AD, and a Franciscan church stands on the traditional site today. No tomb has ever been proposed for the man raised there. No relic has ever been claimed for him, in a period of Christian history when relics were claimed for almost everyone. The earliest raising in the Gospels produced the least documentation of any event in this video. A young man was carried out of a village gate, sent back through it, and never recorded again in any source. His second death was so completely unremarked that no forger in 1900 years found it worth inventing. The Daughter of Jairus. The second raising is the only one of the 3 attributed to Jesus that appears in all 3 synoptic Gospels: Mark chapter 5, Matthew chapter 9, and Luke chapter 8. The setting is a lakeside town in Galilee, generally understood to be Capernaum, and the petitioner is a named man. Jairus, rendered in Greek as Iros from the Hebrew Yair, is described as a ruler of the synagogue, an administrative office rather than a priestly one. The account contains details the other raisings do not. The girl's age is given as 12. Professional mourners were already present in the house, which indicates that death had been publicly confirmed before Jesus arrived. Only 3 disciples and the parents were permitted into the room. Mark preserves the spoken instruction in its original Aramaic, transliterated as Talitha cum, one of a small handful of phrases in the New Testament left untranslated from the language actually spoken. The girl was then instructed to be given food. She is not named. The father is named. The father's job is named. The language is preserved. The age is specified, and the daughter remains anonymous in all 3 accounts. She does not appear again in the New Testament. Jairus does not appear again either. The absence has been noted by commentators since antiquity, without ever being filled. No church claims her burial. No medieval relic list includes her. No apocryphal gospel gives her a later biography, despite the fact that apocryphal literature generously supplied names and careers to almost every unnamed figure in the Gospels, including Pilate's wife and the 2 thieves. 3 separate authors recorded the age of a girl in a room in Galilee. None of them recorded her name, and no one in 19th centuries successfully invented one. She is the only person in this video who was raised from the dead twice into obscurity. The Saints of Matthew 27. The largest raising described in the New Testament occupies 2 verses and appears in one Gospel. Matthew, chapter 27, verses 52 and 53, states that at the moment of the crucifixion, an earthquake opened tombs near Jerusalem, that many bodies of sleeping saints were raised, and that after the resurrection these figures entered the holy city and appeared to many people. No number is given, no name is given. The Greek term used, hagioi, is the standard early Christian word for the faithful dead and gives no indication of period, meaning the raised could be understood as recently deceased Jerusalem believers or as figures from the Hebrew Scriptures. No other gospel records the event. Neither does Paul, writing to the Corinthians about resurrection witnesses roughly 2 decades before Matthew was composed. The theological problem was recognized early and never resolved. If the raised saints resumed ordinary mortal life, they died a second time and were buried again in the same city, which requires a mass of second graves that no one recorded. If they did not, they were assumed into heaven, which would make them the only humans besides Christ to bypass death entirely. Augustine, writing to his correspondent Eutychus in the early 5th century, examined both positions and declined to settle the question. Jerome argued they died again. Later medieval theologians, including Thomas Aquinas in the third part of the Summa Theologiae, laid out both opinions side by side and treated the matter as genuinely open. The passage Rem. Ain's one of the most contested verses in the Gospel of Matthew. Some modern scholars read it as apocalyptic literary imagery drawn from the 12th chapter of Daniel and the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, rather than as reportage. Others treat it as an early Jerusalem tradition preserved only by Matthew. An unspecified number of people were raised in Jerusalem, walked through a city of tens of thousands, appeared to many, and were never mentioned again by any writer in the 1st century. Whether they died a second time has been argued for 1600 years without conclusion. It is the only entry on this list where the second death is not unrecorded but doctrinally undecided. Zeno, and the raisings outside the canon. The only person raised by Jesus who is given a personal name in any early Christian text is not found in the New Testament. He appears in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, a Greek narrative of Jesus' childhood dated by most scholars to the 2nd century, and rejected as authoritative by every major branch of Christianity from the 4th century onward. The text describes a boy named Zeno playing with Jesus on the roof of a house in Nazareth. Zeno fell from the upper story and was killed, and the other children accused Jesus of pushing him. According to the account, Jesus descended, stood over the body, instructed Zeno to rise, and Zeno rose and publicly cleared him of the accusation. The same document contains at least 2 further raisings, including a schoolteacher struck dead and restored, and a child who died of a snake bite. The historical value of the text is not defended by modern scholarship. It survives in Greek, Syriac, Latin, Georgian, Ethiopic, and Old Slavonic versions with substantial variation between them, which indicates centuries of active editing. Its portrait of a child performing lethal and restorative miracles was explicitly condemned by early church writers, and the Galatian Decree, a Latin list of rejected books traditionally dated to the 6th century, names infancy Gospels among the works to be refused. Zeno is nonetheless the most fully described of any raised person in early Christian literature. He is named, his location is given, his cause of death is given, his testimony is recorded, and his motive for testifying is explained. Every one of those details is absent from all 3 canonical raisings. The most complete account of a person raised by Jesus comes from a book the Church spent 1500 years suppressing. Zeno's later death is not recorded there either. The text that invented the most detail did not bother to invent an ending. Tabitha of Joppa. The first raising recorded after the resurrection was performed by an apostle rather than by Jesus, and it is described in the 9th chapter of Acts. The location is Joppa, the Mediterranean port now inside the municipal boundaries of Tel Aviv, and the subject is a woman called Tabitha in Aramaic and Dorcas in Greek. Both names mean gazelle. Acts gives her more biographical detail than it gives most male figures in the same chapters. She is described as devoted to charitable work and to making garments for the widows of the city. She is also the only woman in the entire New Testament given the feminine form of the word disciple, mathetria, a term applied to her and to no one else. Her body had already been washed and laid in an upper room when Peter was summoned from the neighboring town of Lydda. The mourning widows were sent out, and the instruction recorded is direct: Tabitha, arise. Acts states that news of the event spread through Joppa, and that Peter remained in the city for a considerable time afterward, lodging with a tanner named Simon. Tabitha herself is not mentioned again in Acts, in the epistles, or in any first-century source. A burial site was proposed only in the modern period. In 1874, the Russian Orthodox Church acquired land in Jaffa, where excavations uncovered a 4th-century mosaic and rock-cut tombs, and one of these was identified as the tomb of Tabitha. The identification rests on the location matching the biblical setting, and on nothing else. The site remains a functioning pilgrimage destination. The most thoroughly documented woman, and in the book of Acts, was given a name in 2 languages: a profession, a client base, a city, and a unique honorific. Her tomb was assigned to her 18 centuries later by property survey. Eutychus of Troas. The final raising in the New Testament is also the only one caused by the length of a sermon. Acts chapter 20 describes Paul addressing a gathering at Troas on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, in an upper room lit by many lamps on the night before his departure. The account is written in the first-person plural, indicating the author was present. The young man is named Eutychus. He was seated in a window of the 3rd story. Acts records that Paul continued speaking until midnight, that Eutychus was overcome by sleep, and that he fell from the window and was taken up dead. Paul went down, embraced the body, and told the gathering that his life was in him. The narrative then records, without any transition, that Paul went back upstairs, ate, and continued talking until daybreak before leaving the city. The name is the detail that has drawn the most comment. Eutychus, from the Greek Eutychus, means fortunate or lucky. Whether the name was his or was assigned by the narrator has been debated since antiquity. The account is also notable for what it does not do. It offers no interpretation of the event, assigns it no theological significance, and gives it no closing formula. It reads as an incident that occurred and was then set aside in favor of the rest of the sermon. Eutychus is not mentioned in any of Paul's letters, including those written after his time at Troas. No later tradition, Eastern or Western, gives him a death, a burial place, or a feast day. No relic has been claimed. He is the only figure in this video for whom not even a medieval forgery exists. A man fell 3 stories during a sermon, was pronounced dead, was returned to life, and the narrator's next recorded detail is that the meal resumed and the preaching went on until dawn. His second death was never written down by anyone. The luckiest name in the New Testament belongs to its least followed-up survivor. Lazarus of Bethany. The best documented raising in the New Testament produced the most contested second death in Christian history. John, chapter 11, places the event at Bethany, a village on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, roughly 2 miles from Jerusalem, and specifies that the body had been in the tomb 4 days before it was called out. The detail matters, because 4 days exceeded the period in which first-century Jewish tradition considered a soul to remain near the body, making the death legally and religiously final. John is also the only gospel to record a consequence. In chapter 12, verse 10, the chief priests are described as resolving to kill Lazarus as well as Jesus, because his continued existence was drawing crowds to Bethany. The plot is stated plainly. Its outcome is never given. Lazarus is not mentioned again after the meal at Bethany 6 days before the Passover. 2 entirely separate and mutually exclusive traditions filled the gap. The Cypriot tradition holds that Lazarus fled Judea by boat, was appointed the first bishop of Canon on Cyprus by Paul and Barnabas, served 30 years, and died there of natural causes. A tradition attributed to Epiphanius of Salamis in the 4th century states that he was 30 years old when he was raised and lived 30 more. A further Cypriot tradition holds that he never smiled again for the remainder of his life, with a single exception. The Provençal tradition holds instead that he was set adrift from Palestine in a boat without oars or sails alongside Mary Magdalene and Martha, came ashore, near Marseille, became that city's first bishop, and was beheaded during the reign of Domitian. Both traditions produced physical relics, and the relics produced dates. In 890 AD, a marble tomb was uncovered at Kishon, on Cyprus, bearing a Greek inscription reading Lazarus, 4 days dead, friend of Christ. The Byzantine Emperor Leo VI had the remains translated to Constantinople in 898, and paid for the Church of St. Lazarus to be built over the empty tomb in compensation. The Cypriot town that grew around it is called Larnaca, from the Greek larnax, meaning sarcophagus. In France, Autun Cathedral was rebuilt in the 12th century specifically to house Lazarus relics acquired from Marseille in the 10th, and Marseille retained its own. Modern scholarship regards the Provençal tradition as a medieval development, most likely arising from the conflation of Lazarus of Bethany with a genuine 5th century bishop of Aix who bore the same name. The Cypriot claim received an unexpected addition within living memory. During renovation work beneath the Church of St. Lazarus at Larnaca in 1972, a marble sarcophagus containing human remains was found under the altar, in a tomb that had been recorded as emptied in 898. The remains are venerated there today. A man was raised from the dead once, plotted against by the priesthood, and then buried in 2 countries, translated to a third, dismembered across at least 4 cathedral treasuries, and excavated again 17 years before the moon landing. He is the only person in Christian history to have been assigned 2 complete second deaths, in 2 different centuries, on 2 different coasts, and to have had a town in Cyprus named after his coffin. The scriptures record that he was called out of a tomb. Almost everything else about him has been recorded by the tombs. There is one further case, and it is the only one in which the outcome is not silent, contested, or supplied by relic hunters. Every person in this video was returned to ordinary mortal life. Each remains subject to age, illness, and injury, and each therefore died a second time, whether or not the event was recorded. This is the standard theological position, and it is the reason the raisings are described in the Gospels as signs rather than as resurrections. They restored a life that would end again. The distinction is drawn explicitly in the letters of Paul. Writing to the church at Rome, in the 6th chapter, verse 9, he states that Christ, having been raised from the dead, dies no more, and that death has no further dominion over him. Writing to Corinth, in the 15th chapter, he calls the resurrection the first fruits, meaning the first instance of a category rather than a repetition of the raisings that preceded it. The accounts in Luke and Acts end not with a second burial but with an ascension, and no relic of the body has ever been claimed by any church in 2,000 years, in a tradition that has claimed relics of the manger, the nails, the crown, the shroud, and the cross. 7 people were recorded as having been brought back from the dead in the New Testament. 6 of them left behind no grave, no death notice, and no ending. The 7th left behind an empty tomb, and the difference between those two kinds of silence is the entire argument. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video in the comments.